Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it completely fries your brain. Forget secret police and military parades. The real weapon of a tyrant is forcing millions to believe absolute, unhinged garbage. From claiming they invented pizza to legally promoting a horse, here are 32 of the dumbest, most absurd lies dictators actually made their citizens accept as hard scientific fact. 1. In 1958, right in the middle of the utterly disastrous Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong pitched an idea so wild it sounds like a rejected comic book villain plot. He actually promised the Chinese citizens that his government would build them a brand new, fully functioning artificial sun. Yes, you heard that completely right. While millions of desperate people were melting down their only cooking pots in useless backyard furnaces just to meet absurd steel quotas, their glorious leader was out there hyping up a personal state-sponsored star. It was the ultimate bait-and-switch distraction tactic. Imagine your house is actively burning to the ground, and your landlord shows up to excitedly announce he is installing a luxury rooftop jacuzzi. The sheer audacity of this lie is honestly breathtaking. Unsurprisingly, they did not manage to construct a miniature sun to light up the night sky. It turns out that mastering nuclear fusion requires a tiny bit more scientific expertise than just yelling at exhausted farmers and really wanting it to happen. 2. Let us kick things off with a dictator who literally claimed he hacked human biology. Over in North Korea, the state propaganda machine relentlessly told the public that their great leader, Kim Il-sung, had reached a level of absolute physical perfection. The mandatory official truth was that this man simply did not urinate or defecate. Ever. Try to picture the high-level government meeting where some terrified official had to approve that specific detail. It is a lie so monumentally audacious that it crosses the line from weird into absolute comedy. But for the citizens, this bizarre fantasy was drilled into their heads from the moment they could walk. Young school children were strictly taught that their leader was a pure, self-sustaining miracle engine who had no need for basic plumbing. Questioning this biological impossibility was treated as high treason. An entire nation was forced to seriously accept that their ruler had somehow edited his own digestive tract out of existence just to make more room for his boundless greatness. 3. Muammar Gaddafi was undeniably a master of toxic branding, and his absolute crowning achievement was his personal security detail known as the Amazonian Guard. This was a heavily armed, all-female squad of elite bodyguards who followed him everywhere. But the core lie he shamelessly sold to his citizens and the global press was their supposed primary job qualification. He strictly insisted that every single woman in this deadly phalanx had to be a virgin. The official and deeply creepy justification was that their absolute purity made them immune to corruption or bribery. The actual reality behind this claim was just a spectacularly genius public relations stunt. It instantly created an unforgettable, highly cinematic image of a mysterious and untouchable desert king flanked by a squad of lethal warrior priestesses. This carefully crafted myth became a massive part of his terrifying legend, serving as a potent symbol of his bizarre authority that absolutely fascinated and horrified everyone who ever crossed his path. 4. Here is a terrifying masterclass in how to turn blind national pride into total national suicide. Back in the 1860s, the dictator of the tiny landlocked nation of Paraguay, Francisco Solano Lopez, looked at his deeply outgunned country and somehow saw an unstoppable global superpower. Imagine the coach of a terrible high school soccer team genuinely believing they could effortlessly crush the World Cup champions. He aggressively sold his people on a gloriously lethal lie, convincing them they could easily wipe out the combined military might of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay all at exactly the same time. He promised a fast and wildly victorious campaign. Instead, he plunged his citizens into the War of the Triple Alliance, a conflict so unbelievably catastrophic that it completely wiped out over 60% of the entire Paraguayan population, including almost every single adult male. It was an epic delusion of world-ending proportions that very nearly erased a sovereign nation right off the map. 5. You can go ahead and delete your local weather application right now. Over in North Korea, the daily forecast is literally just whatever the Kim family feels like experiencing that day. State media regularly reports that their supreme leaders possess the magical ability to control the climate using nothing but their minds. Are you freezing through an unusually brutal winter? Do not panic, because the dear leader will simply use his brainwaves to make it warmer. Do the generals need some highly picturesque snow for a massive military parade? He can instantly conjure a blizzard on command. Just try to imagine the sheer, sweaty panic of being the chief national meteorologist in Pyongyang. You have to look at a radar showing a massive incoming hurricane and then confidently announce glorious sunshine just because the boss woke up in a fantastic mood. It is the ultimate tyrannical power trip, a mandatory lie that demands total submission not just from the starving population, but from the clouds, the wind, and the sky itself. 6. Now we have to talk about Benito Mussolini, who was essentially the original toxic hustle culture influencer. Italian fascist propaganda did not just try to convince people that he was a capable politician. They aggressively marketed him as a literal superhuman and a demigod of absolute efficiency. The mandatory official line was that Il Duce was so incredibly powerful that he only required 4 hours of sleep every night, leaving him to work 22-hour days to forge the destiny of Italy. They also claimed he was a genius airplane pilot, an unbeatable master swordsman, an absolutely irresistible romantic lover, and a man who could probably bench press a military tank. The entire goal was to build a fanatical cult of personality around a biologically superior machine powered entirely by sheer fascist willpower and excessive amounts of espresso. The massive lie was that he had somehow evolved past the biological need for a nap, acting as a sleepless savior for a nation he was actively dragging into a total nightmare. 7. Joseph Stalin was a man personally responsible for the brutal deaths of millions through endless purges, engineered famines, and freezing gulags, yet he somehow pulled off one of the most successful rebranding campaigns in human history. His big lie was presenting himself as the ultimate father of nations. He desperately wanted to be seen as a kind, gentle, and deeply caring figure who adored children and personally watched over the well-being of every single Soviet citizen. It was the absolute peak of 20th century social media filtering before the internet even existed. While he was ruthlessly signing thousands of death warrants and orchestrating mass terror behind closed doors, massive state posters depicted him flashing a warm, grandfatherly smile while holding a perfectly healthy, well-fed child. It is a lie so incredibly cynical and utterly detached from the horrifying blood-soaked reality that it borders on performance art. He was a loving father in the exact same way a hurricane is a gentle summer breeze. 8. What exactly do you do when a massive global superpower completely cuts diplomatic ties with your government? If you happen to be the notorious Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, you do not bother sending an angry letter. You just completely rewrite reality itself. After a massive political fallout with Britain in 1972, Amin simply stood up and officially declared himself the undisputed conqueror of the British Empire. There were absolutely no shots fired and 0 troops deployed anywhere. It was just pure, unfiltered, radioactive ego. To really sell this bizarre fantasy to the public, he staged an incredibly humiliating spectacle. Just picture a massive gilded wooden throne being carried through the dusty streets of Kampala by 4 sweating, absolutely terrified British businessmen. Meanwhile, the state-controlled media relentlessly hailed this ridiculous parade as a monumental military victory, forcing the Ugandan citizens to celebrate a glorious war that existed entirely inside their dictator's deeply unstable mind. 9. Picture this incredibly awkward historical scene. Joseph Stalin, arguably one of the most feared and ruthlessly powerful men on the entire planet, is wrapping up a major public speech. He delivers his final sentence, and the massive crowd instantly erupts into thunderous, deafening applause. But if you listen really closely beneath the sound of terrified human hands slapping together, you can hear a faint, rhythmic clacking noise. That is the actual sound of the most pathetic lie in Soviet history. To absolutely guarantee that his speeches received the legendary adoration they supposedly deserved, state officials literally hid wooden, mechanical clappers among the live audience to artificially boost the volume of the cheering. The man who commanded a massive nuclear-armed superpower and could erase anyone with a single pen stroke was so deeply and embarrassingly insecure that he required a secret army of wooden sticks to validate his ego. It has to be the loneliest and saddest sound in the entire history of global tyranny. 10. Thousands of years before modern influencers started faking their luxurious vacations on the internet, Pharaoh Rameses II completely perfected the fine art of the massive public lie. Way back around 1274 before Christ, he confidently led his massive Egyptian army into the Battle of Kadesh and got absolutely demolished. It was a chaotic, incredibly bloody military disaster that he only barely managed to survive by running away. So what did this ancient master of public relations do next? He sprinted back home and immediately launched the most successful and aggressive propaganda campaign in ancient history. He boldly told his entire kingdom that he had just won an epic, gloriously heroic victory. And to make sure nobody argued, he literally carved that lie into solid stone. Across massive temple walls all over Egypt, he commissioned giant murals of himself single-handedly slaughtering his terrified enemies. It was the ancient world's first heavily edited war report, and it somehow worked perfectly. 11. Muammar Gaddafi had a deeply ingrained habit of making public claims that were so completely divorced from actual reality that they deserve their own dedicated museum of madness. But this specific lie is truly something special. The Libyan dictator once stood up and confidently declared to the world that he, Muammar Gaddafi, was the original inventor of pizza. We really need to pause and fully appreciate the sheer, magnificent insanity of that exact statement. This is not just a standard political lie. This is a direct declaration of war on the entire nation of Italy, on recorded culinary history, and on literally every single pizzeria operating on planet Earth. Just try to imagine him seriously explaining this concept to his confused generals. It takes a spectacularly rare kind of blinding ego to look at one of the most universally beloved and heavily documented foods in human existence and boldly claim you dreamed it up in the desert. Forget all his political crimes, because this was a culinary felony of historic proportions. 12. Benito Mussolini was definitely not just a standard brutal dictator. He was essentially the original pioneer of aggressive personal branding. He understood that he did not just need absolute political power. He desperately needed a superhero origin story that he could sell to the gullible masses. So his dedicated propaganda team boldly claimed that he had personally invented the entire complex ideology of fascism when he was just 17 years old. But the absolute crowning masterpiece of his ridiculous personal mythos was the heavily circulated lie that he once fought a fully grown, angry lion using only his bare hands. And obviously, he claimed he won. It is exactly the kind of highly exaggerated nonsense your drunkest uncle tells at a family barbecue, except an entire European nation was legally forced to nod soberly and agree with it. He was aggressively building a brand to convince his fanatical followers that their leader was an invincible, lion-wrestling demigod who could easily conquer nature itself before his morning coffee. 13. Long before you could simply untag yourself from an incredibly awkward party photo on the internet, Joseph Stalin successfully invented the ultimate permanent block button. Welcome to the terrifying reality of the Soviet memory hole. Whenever a highly ranked government official suddenly became an official enemy of the state, they were not just quietly arrested and thrown into a freezing gulag. They were literally deleted from recorded history. Teams of highly skilled state artists would go to work on official government photographs using sharp scalpels and primitive airbrushes to meticulously wipe a human being completely out of existence. One day, you are a celebrated revolutionary hero, standing shoulder to shoulder with Stalin. And the very next week, you are magically replaced by a potted plant or a suspiciously empty patch of brick wall. It was the most brutal and psychologically damaging form of national gaslighting imaginable, forcing millions of terrified citizens to pretend their former leaders had never actually been born. 14. Picture the ancient city of Rome, the absolute center of the civilized world, packed with brilliant engineers, legendary philosophers, and battle-hardened warriors. Now imagine that in the early 3rd century, this massive empire was completely ruled by an unpredictable teenager named Elagabalus, who suddenly decided the ultimate god of the city should be a giant rock. This is entirely factual. He literally dragged a massive black, cone-shaped stone all the way from Syria, officially declared it the supreme deity of the universe, and forced the most powerful, wealthy senators in the world to publicly worship it. Just try to picture the sheer, agonizing humiliation of that moment. These were ruthless men who had conquered entire nations, now being legally forced to bow down and chant religious hymns to a holy paperweight. Elagabalus even threw a wildly expensive public wedding ceremony to marry his favorite rock to a statue of a goddess. It was the ultimate spoiled rich kid fantasy, violently forced upon an entire empire. 15. How exactly do you handle the incredibly stressful complexities of international diplomacy and foreign trade? Well, if you happen to be the paranoid 19th century dictator of Paraguay known as El Supremo, the answer is remarkably simple. You just completely ghost the entire planet Earth. This was not just standard political isolationism, it was the absolute ultimate act of national ghosting. Convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single foreigner was a highly trained spy coming to get him, he issued a simple but utterly terrifying decree. He completely sealed the national borders. For nearly 30 agonizing years, Paraguay essentially hung a massive, heavily armed "Do Not Disturb" sign on its frontiers. Nobody was allowed in, and absolutely nobody was allowed out. He successfully turned an entire vibrant country into his own personal claustrophobic panic room. It violently proves that the absolute scariest dictator is not always the guy screaming on a balcony, but the one who enforces a completely suffocating silence. 16. Back in 1958, Chairman Mao looked around his massive country and confidently identified the absolute greatest existential threat to the Chinese people. It was not the looming shadow of capitalism or political dissent. It was the completely average, incredibly humble sparrow. In a staggering moment of profoundly terrible ecological wisdom, he officially declared a ruthless war on these tiny birds simply because they ate a little bit of grain. He heavily mobilized millions of citizens with one insane mission. They had to aggressively bang loud pots and pans together without stopping until the terrified sparrows had nowhere safe to land and literally dropped dead out of the sky from pure exhaustion. The terrifying part is that it actually worked, and the birds were wiped out. But then a biblical plague of ravenous insects swarmed the crops, completely destroying the harvest because their natural predators were dead. It was a masterclass in triggering a massive, apocalyptic famine based on a spectacularly stupid lie. 17. Every single incredibly corrupt dictator eventually faces the exact same highly awkward problem. They have to somehow explain their obscenely massive, diamond-encrusted personal wealth to a completely starving and desperate population. Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines came up with a massive lie so brilliantly childish that you almost have to respect the sheer audacity of it. He obviously did not admit that he was ruthlessly robbing the national treasury blind. Instead, he boldly claimed that he had simply stumbled upon the legendary lost treasure of a World War II Japanese general known as Yamashita. It is the exact geopolitical equivalent of telling your angry spouse that you bought a luxury sports car because you found a magical leprechaun in the backyard. For 2 entire decades, this ridiculous fairy tale was the mandatory official story. He completely rebranded himself from a ruthless, thieving tyrant into a lucky, real-life action hero who just happened to trip over massive mountains of solid gold bars in his free time. 18. When you are a highly brutal dictator operating with a deeply questionable mandate to rule, you definitely need to spice up your historical resume. Saddam Hussein suddenly decided his personal backstory desperately needed a heavy touch of absolute divine intervention. Back in the 1980s, he officially commissioned a highly motivated team of terrified genealogists to rapidly produce a massive family tree that definitively proved he was a direct blood descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. This was absolutely not a polite suggestion. It immediately became a mandatory state-sanctioned historical fact. It was the absolute peak of historical identity theft. Just picture the incredibly tense meeting where he ordered his scribes to magically connect a violent politician from Tikrit all the way back to the 7th century. It is a classic, deeply cynical tyrant move, desperately attempting to wrap a horrifying legacy of endless brutality and torture inside a protective, bulletproof cloak of untouchable religious holiness. 19. While most average dictators are perfectly happy just rewriting their own local history, Muammar Gaddafi actively tried to steal the entire world's cultural heritage. In one of the most wonderfully unhinged and bizarre moments of pure historical revisionism ever recorded, he aggressively insisted that the legendary playwright William Shakespeare was actually not an Englishman at all. According to Gaddafi, the famous writer was actually a hidden Arab sheikh named Zubair. I promise you that you cannot make this level of delusion up. He was not making a weird joke. This was aggressively presented to his people as a newly recovered absolute historical truth. Just try to imagine being an exhausted Libyan high school student who is legally forced to write a serious, academic essay about Sheikh Zubair's classic revenge tragedy, Hamlet. This was not just a quirky, harmless delusion. It was an act of aggressive cultural larceny on a massive global scale, proving that absolute power completely destroys your grip on basic human reality. 20. How exactly do you instantly know that a future totalitarian dictator is genuinely destined for absolute greatness? Well, if you happen to be Kim Jong-il, your arrival on planet Earth is not just a standard medical event, it is a heavily scripted special effects-laden blockbuster movie. The mandatory official North Korean story strictly dictates that he was absolutely not born in a standard, boring hospital room. Instead, his propaganda claims he was magically born on the freezing peaks of the sacred Mount Pektu, and his glorious arrival was instantly heralded by the spontaneous appearance of a massive double rainbow. But a rainbow was not enough, so they added a brightly glowing new star appearing in the sky and claimed that local birds literally started singing his praises in fluent Korean. It honestly sounds like the opening sequence to an animated musical directed by a madman. This aggressively absurd lie perfectly set the stage for his entire reign of terror, establishing a reality so weird that questioning it meant certain death. 21. The incredibly toxic cult of personality surrounding Teodoro Obiang in Equatorial Guinea rapidly escalated from standard political flattery into absolute terrifying blasphemy. Sometime in the early 2000s, the heavily state-controlled national radio station broadcasted a deeply chilling official announcement to the entire terrified country. The broadcaster boldly declared that the president was literally just like God in heaven, and that he was in permanent, direct contact with the almighty creator of the universe. But the absolute kicker was the terrifying conclusion they drew from this. They announced that he therefore possessed the ultimate divine power to kill absolutely anyone without ever being called to account. Let us really break down how insane that is. This was not a poetic metaphor. It was a massive public declaration that the president had a literal, heaven-sent license to murder his citizens. When your political leader claims to have God mode enabled in real life, you are trapped in a horrifying nightmare. 22. You can go ahead and completely forget absolutely everything you think you know about peak human athletic achievement. According to the completely serious reports from North Korean state media, the absolute greatest professional golfer to ever walk the face of the earth was actually Kim Jong-il. The utterly ridiculous fairy tale they aggressively spun and legally forced millions of starving citizens to believe was that the very first time he ever picked up a golf club in his entire life, he played a mathematically perfect game. The official state record boldly claims that he shot an impossible 11 holes in one during a single 18-hole round. This was absolutely not reported as just a lucky afternoon on the green. It was aggressively presented as hard scientific proof of the dear leader's absolute divine mastery over the physical laws of the universe. It was a mandatory piece of national mythology designed to prove that even gravity and physics were too terrified to disobey the commands of the supreme leader. 23. Muammar Gaddafi was definitely not just a standard political tyrant. He was essentially a phenomenally cheap stage magician whose grand illusions completely fell apart the exact second you stopped looking at them. His absolute favorite signature trick was magically making the barren desert bloom with life. He would intentionally fly in busloads of gullible foreign journalists to a completely remote, dead patch of the scorching Sahara. Then, with a massive theatrical flourish, he would reveal a wonderfully lush, heavily irrigated green garden right in the sand. The amazed reporters would rapidly snap their photographs, write glowing articles about his agricultural genius, and fly back to Europe. But the exact second their airplanes took off, the magic instantly died. His guards would shut off the hidden water pumps, the underground pipes would run bone dry, and the miraculous garden would rapidly shrivel up and die under the brutal sun. It was a breathtakingly cynical, wildly expensive lie built entirely for a 24-hour news cycle. 24. While the vast majority of standard dictators heavily rely on brutal secret police forces and massive standing armies to maintain control, François Papa Doc Duvalier of Haiti utilized a completely different and utterly terrifying weapon. He weaponized supernatural public relations. He spent years meticulously crafting a terrifying public image of himself as a vastly powerful voodoo priest, intentionally dressing exactly like Baron Samedi, the fearsome spirit of death, complete with dark sunglasses and a top hat. But he took this terrifying lie to an entirely new level in 1963. When United States President John F. Kennedy was tragically assassinated, sending massive shockwaves across the entire globe, Papa Doc calmly stepped up to a microphone and actually claimed full credit for the murder. He boldly told his terrified citizens that he had personally killed the American leader using a highly powerful voodoo curse. It was an absolute masterstroke of psychological terror that completely paralyzed his political enemies. 25. Picture the incredibly tense global atmosphere of the 1970s. The massive Cold War is actively raging, the intense space race is pushing boundaries, and humanity is looking toward the future. Meanwhile, according to the deeply eccentric dictator Hastings Banda, the absolute greatest existential threat facing the African nation of Malawi was women wearing trousers. Yes, you heard that correctly. In a truly spectacular display of wildly misplaced political priorities, he officially declared that any woman wearing pants was committing a highly toxic moral crime against the entire state, and he completely banned them by law. Women were strictly forced to wear skirts at all times. He even unleashed his fanatical political youth league, known as the Young Pioneers, to aggressively act as a violent, state-sponsored fashion police force. They would publicly shame and attack any woman who dared to defy his deeply deranged dress code, proving that absolute power makes people incredibly weird about basic human clothing choices. 26. The incredibly unstable Roman Emperor Caligula took one long, disgusted look at the highly respected political establishment of his massive empire and apparently thought his actual horse could do a significantly better job. In a truly magnificent act of pure, unfiltered political contempt, he boldly announced his serious intention to appoint his absolutely favorite horse, Incitatus, as a highly powerful Roman consul. This was definitely not just a quirky, harmless story about a rich guy loving his pet. It was a brutally aggressive political satire brought to terrifying life. Just imagine the sheer, agonizing awkwardness of that exact scene. You have incredibly wealthy, battle-hardened senators in their expensive togas, clutching their historical scrolls, completely frozen in absolute disbelief, while a literal horse loudly neighs from the Senate floor. And the absolute worst part is that they could not even roll their eyes, because the lunatic suggesting this insane promotion held the absolute power of life and death over all of them. 27. The absolute absurdity of North Korean state propaganda is truly the gift that never stops giving, and this specific glittering gem comes directly from a highly official, state-mandated manual for school teachers. The incredibly serious subject of this textbook is the supposedly glorious, godlike childhood of Kim Jong-un. According to this completely fabricated historical document, the future supreme leader of the nation successfully learned how to drive a full-sized automobile at the incredibly tender age of exactly 3 years old. Most average toddlers are still aggressively struggling to figure out how a basic plastic spoon works. But this kid was supposedly out there executing mathematically perfect parallel parks in a massive vehicle. You really have to visualize the sheer comedy of a tiny, chubby toddler strapped into a booster seat, violently wrestling with a massive steering wheel. This deeply stupid lie was aggressively designed to convince terrified children that their political leaders are literal, unstoppable, living gods. 28. Back in communist Romania, the absolute fastest path to achieving legendary scientific glory featured a truly hilarious, deeply corrupt shortcut. You simply had to be married to the supreme dictator. Elena Ceausescu was a highly arrogant woman whose actual formal education barely managed to scrape past the 4th grade level. Yet she was aggressively hailed by the terrified state media as a world-changing absolute genius of modern chemistry. It was essentially the entire world's most incredibly elaborate and deeply depressing elementary school science fair project. The actual brilliant scientists of the country would lock themselves in laboratories for years, making massive breakthroughs, only to be legally forced to present their entire life's work to Elena, a woman who likely thought a complex molecule was a type of small, furry animal. They then had to stand there in agonizing silence while she boldly slapped her own name on their research, turning the entire National Scientific Academy into her own personal, fraudulent ghostwriting service. 29. Right in the absolute middle of the incredibly blood-soaked, chaotic nightmare of the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre suddenly decided that violently executing the king and thousands of wealthy aristocrats was simply not enough. He aggressively decided that he desperately needed to completely execute God as well. But since he knew the terrified peasants still needed something to blindly worship, he literally just invented his own brand new religion entirely from scratch, boldly calling it the cult of the Supreme Being. And you will never guess who he immediately appointed as the ultimate high priest of this ridiculous new faith. Himself, obviously. He aggressively organized these bizarre, deeply awkward public festivals where deeply traumatized citizens were legally forced to sing weird songs and celebrate incredibly vague, abstract concepts like pure reason. It was basically a massive, state-mandated corporate team building exercise completely devoid of any actual spiritual depth, and it hilariously collapsed almost immediately. 30. The wildly unstable Roman Emperor Commodus looked deeply into his royal mirror and absolutely did not see a standard political ruler staring back at him. He genuinely saw a living, breathing superhero action figure, and he aggressively demanded that the entire known world play along with his delusion. Right around the year 192, he suddenly decided that being the most powerful emperor on Earth was completely boring, and he forced the terrified Roman Senate to officially declare him the literal, breathing reincarnation of the legendary demigod Hercules. He completely committed to the insane bit, aggressively strutting into highly official public gatherings wearing a massive, smelly lion skin cape while swinging a giant wooden club around. He even forced people to watch him fight as a gladiator in the massive arena, though his terrified opponents were usually heavily injured men or completely tied-up animals. The massive crowd still had to cheer wildly because booing a fake god was a fantastic way to get yourself instantly executed. 31. Just try to imagine being legally forced to live inside a truly bizarre, heavily censored alternate universe where absolutely every single brilliant idea in human history magically came from just one specific country. Welcome to the deeply insecure reality of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. This was not just standard, slightly annoying national pride. It was a massive, highly coordinated full-scale assault on basic recorded reality. Soviet state propaganda relentlessly pushed the incredibly stupid lie that Russian citizens had single-handedly invented absolutely everything. They aggressively claimed that Thomas Edison was a massive fraud and that a Russian invented the light bulb. They boldly stated the Wright brothers were just lucky, thieving amateurs who stole the airplane from Soviet geniuses. Every single exhausted schoolchild was violently forced to memorize this pathetic, retroactive plagiarism. It was essentially the world's most embarrassing group project, where one deeply insecure nation tried to steal credit for the entire history of human innovation. 32. Have you ever sat at your desk and genuinely wished you possessed the absolute magical power to literally control time itself? Well, the wildly eccentric dictator of Turkmenistan, Sapir Murat Niyazov, actually went ahead and did it. Back in 2002, he aggressively executed a highly hostile, state-sponsored takeover of the standard Gregorian calendar, boldly declaring it completely outdated and useless. He then proceeded to aggressively rename almost all the months and days of the week directly after himself, his completely confused family members, and his own personal, highly rambling book of political philosophy. Just imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the month of May has been legally renamed after your boss's favorite pet dog. The deeply oppressed Turkmen people had absolutely no choice but to comply. Using the old normal calendar was officially considered a massive act of political treason, completely trapping an entire terrified nation inside the suffocating, inescapable timeline of one man's absolutely astronomical ego. Absolute power clearly causes brain damage. Be honest. If you violently seized control of a country tomorrow, what is the most aggressively stupid, physically impossible lie you would legally force your citizens to believe? Don't hold back. Drop your most unhinged dictator fantasy in the comments. Prove you have better ideas than these guys by hitting like and subscribing right now.